The first time the Roman Empire turned on the Christians traces back to a dinner table. Not a battlefield, a dinner. In the year 54, an emperor named Claudius sat down to eat. He was 63, tired, and famously loved mushrooms. His wife, Agrippina, arranged the meal. She also arranged the poisoner, and the food taster who let it through, and the doctor who stood by, not to save him it turned out, but to press a second, faster poison down his throat when the first one was too slow. By morning, the emperor was dead, and his wife's 17-year-old son became the emperor. You've heard of him. His name was Nero. 10 years later, when he burned Rome, Nero needed someone to blame. He chose the Christians. The Apostle Peter died in that persecution. Tradition says Paul did too. The first Roman campaign to destroy the church, all of it traces back to a dinner of poisoned mushrooms arranged by the emperor's wife. In the ancient world, the most important thing that happened all day happened at a table. I'm J.C. Helm. I write novels about the first followers of Jesus, the ordinary people who spread the story in his first fragile years. Stay with me because this one starts with a murder at dinner. Meals today are very different. To us, dinner is where the day winds down. In first century Ephesus, dinner was where the day's real work got done. The shared meal was the center of public life, the place where business deals were struck and sealed, where a patron met the people who owed him loyalty, where alliances were made, where fathers arranged marriages, where the gods were honored before anyone lifted a cup. If something that mattered was going to happen in that city, it happened around food. And every one of those meals did one more thing. Quietly, underneath all the rest, it told you your status. Where you were placed in the room announced your worth to everyone. What you were served announced it again. They even poured the wine by rank, the good wine for the honored guests near the host, the thin, watered wine carried to the people at the far end. To be invited at all was to be told you counted for something. To be invited and seated was to be told exactly how much. Nobody thought it was cruel. It was simply the truth of the world laid out in bread and wine. The meal was a mirror. You looked into it and saw precisely where you stood. And here's the thing we almost never talk about. Men and women didn't walk into that room as equals. For a man of standing, the banquet was where he became more of himself. He did his business there. He built his alliances there. He measured himself against the men on the better couches and made sure his sons married well. The table was where a man's public life was won. For a woman, the same table was a narrower, more guarded place. In many of these gatherings, she was not a full guest at all. She might serve. She might be seated apart. Where she was welcome, her place was usually borrowed. She was there as someone's wife, someone's daughter. And the meal that raised a man's standing often reminded a woman of how little her standing was. The room that made him larger could make her invisible. Hold on to that, because in a moment we're going to walk up a hill to a table that broke every rule I just described. 7 kilometers above Ephesus, on a hill called Mount Ceressos, there was a small stone house. And in the very same decade that an empress was poisoning her husband at one kind of table, a handful of people were climbing that hill to sit at a completely different one. That table is what my novel is about. It's called Supper with Mary, and it comes out this October. And I keep returning to their meals because the meal is where you can see how the early church spread. They met in homes, back rooms behind a shop, upper rooms and courtyards, and they sat down to eat. They broke the rules. A successful merchant sat next to a slave, and the bread passed both ways. The wine that reached the far end of the room was the same wine poured at the front. Women reclined at the tables as equals, not as servers, not seated apart, welcomed by name. They all shared a holy kiss. The table didn't rank you. For the first time, being invited to a meal didn't tell you your place in the world. It told you the ranking was gone. The food was nothing to speak of. Olives, cheese, figs, and bread. 2 generations later, when a Roman governor tortured Christians to find out what they did in secret, the answer almost bored him. They gathered before dawn, they sang, they shared, in his own words, ordinary and innocent food. The radical thing was never the menu. The radical thing was who was allowed to sit down. And in my book, an old woman sat among them. She had held a baby in a stable once. She had watched him grow into a man and stood at the foot of his cross and not looked away. Now she listened to weavers and fishermen retell the stories she had lived. Mostly she watched. The meal had a heart, and Mary was sitting at it. This is how radical it was. When people looked at these gatherings, they couldn't find a word that fit. This wasn't a guild. Guilds ranked their members. It wasn't a synagogue, not a household, not a school of philosophy. Nothing in the ancient world looked like a table where a slave and her master called each other brother or sister and meant it. It was so far outside every category that the old word simply failed, and so a brand new word had to be invented just to name these people. We still use it. They called them Christians. This new kind of table was so radical that the world had to build a new name to hold it. Now this is where it stops being a fantasy and becomes a real story, because saying yes to that table came with a cost. For a silversmith, leaving the old gods meant leaving the guild, and leaving the guild meant losing the work that fed his family. That is literally how the riots in Acts begins. A silversmith stands up and warns the others that the Christians are going to ruin their trade. For a slave, being treated as a sister at a supper brought a dignity her owner had no right to honor the next morning, and the whispers followed all of them. They were called atheists for refusing the gods, and accused of the darkest things people could invent, simply because they called one another brother and sister, and no outsider understood what that meant. The invitation wasn't cheap. Everyone gave up something real to be in that room. So here's the only question that matters. Why did the table grow? Because of the joy. That joy was the center of everything. When they came through that door, something happened that wasn't happening anywhere else in Ephesus. There was laughter, real laughter. There was singing, old psalms sent to new hymns, hummed low before sunrise so the neighbors wouldn't start asking questions. There was almost always a child or two slipping between the cushions while the bread went around, and a grandmother shushing them with one hand while she reached for an olive with the other. And for 1 hour in that room, you were fully known and you completely belonged, and no one was measuring you at all. If you've lived your whole life being ranked, and everyone in that city had, sitting down at a table where the ranking simply stops isn't a small comfort. It's like a window thrown open in a house. That was the joy. A joy people couldn't explain and couldn't stop thinking about. A joy so real that the cost of losing the guild, losing the work, losing the good opinion of the neighbors, all of it was worth the price. And they didn't endure the cost and settle for a little peace. They paid the cost and found something worth far more than what they gave up. That's why the table grew. Now take that joy and carry it back to where we started, back to Agrippina and the dinner where she arranged to kill her husband. 2 tables, in the same decade, in the same empire. One at the top of the world, arranged around fear, poisoned mushrooms, a son climbing over his stepfather's body toward a throne, and a meal that would end in Rome burning and dead apostles. And one up a quiet hill, comforted by joy, the same wine in every cup, a slave and a merchant calling each other family, an old woman watching it all with a peace the emperor's palace couldn't buy at any price. Imagine, what if Claudius had eaten at the second kind of table? What if Agrippina had spent her evenings in that back room behind the shop, where the seating was wrong on purpose and the woman beside her called her sister and meant it? What if Nero had grown up at a supper that produced joy instead of one that produced fear? Would the fire have been lit? Would Peter and Paul have expanded their ministries even further? We'll never know. Agrippina ate her dinner. The empire turned. Nero rose. Rome burned. But that small, joyful meal up the hill, the one with no head of the table, quietly outlasted every emperor who ever tried to end it. The table of fear built the empire. The table of joy still grows. If you want to hear more stories of the first followers, the one who spread the words of Jesus, subscribe at jchelm.com. I send 1 letter a month. No noise, just the book, the history, and a question we're sitting with. I read every reply. And here's the part I want to leave with you. The joy those first followers found isn't locked in the past. It's still available to us right now. And it's embarrassingly simple. Invite one person to your table this week, not the usual person. Maybe someone you don't really know yet, Maybe someone you wanted to understand better and never made time for. Set a place for them. Pass the bread both ways. That's the whole secret the first Christians stumbled onto. Try it this week. Invite someone new to your table.